The desert wind howled across the Arizona plains as Sheriff Dane Hollister sat by a flickering campfire. A few feet away, an Apache woman sat chained to a wagon wheel, her wrists bruised, her eyes fierce and unbroken. He'd captured her at Dry Creek Pass, accused of raiding settlers. Yet beneath the dirt and defiance, she looked more like a survivor than an enemy. The crackling firelight painted shifting shadows across her face, and for the first time, Dane found himself wondering if the wanted posters ever told the truth about anyone. He had seen killers before, men who smiled as they pulled the trigger, but there was no malice in her eyes, only a quiet strength, something wild and wounded all at once. The night grew colder. Coyotes cried in the distance, their voices echoing across the open plain like ghosts calling each other home. Dane tossed another log into the fire and rubbed his hands together. The flames danced, throwing warmth across his weathered boots and the cold steel of her chains. The woman didn't shiver, though the frost bit through her torn buckskin dress. She sat tall, proud, watching the fire like it was the only living thing left that understood her. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but heavy, each word slow, as though carved from stone. "This night," she said, "I don't want to sleep alone in the cold." Dane froze. For a heartbeat, the sound of the wind seemed to vanish, and all he could hear was the crackle of the fire and the pounding of his own heart. He'd faced outlaws, rustlers, and dying men, but nothing unsettled him like the gentleness in her tone. He wasn't sure if it was a plea, a test, or something else entirely. "You'll get warmth enough from that fire," he replied, his voice rougher than he intended. Her lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "You think fire keeps the cold away? It only reminds you how close the dark is." Her words stung more than he expected. He didn't answer. He didn't know how to. He'd spent years sleeping beside campfires, watching the flames flicker until dawn, pretending the heat was company. But sitting across from her, he realized how lonely the desert could feel, even with someone just a few feet away. He sighed, pulled off his thick wool blanket, and tossed it toward her. She caught it in silence, her fingers trembling slightly as she drew it around her shoulders. He noticed the faint scars on her wrists, not all from chains. Some older, some deeper. He looked away quickly. The minutes stretched on. The fire cracked. Somewhere far off, a horse snorted in the dark. Dane leaned back against his saddle, trying to convince himself that he'd done the right thing by capturing her. The settlers had demanded justice after another caravan was ambushed, 3 dead, wagons burned. He'd tracked the raiders for days until he found her alone among the rocks, wounded, clutching a blood-stained knife. But even then, something had felt wrong. She hadn't fought him. She'd simply raised her hands and said, "Do what you came to do, white man." Those words had haunted him since. Now, in the silence of the desert night, he wondered what story the blood on her knife had really told. Maybe she was guilty. Maybe she wasn't. But she didn't look like someone who'd ever chosen this life. The firelight glinted off her hair, long and tangled, yet somehow still beautiful. Dane found himself studying her, without meaning to. The way her eyes stayed fixed on the flames, the way she breathed slow, steady, as if she'd already made peace with something he couldn't understand. Then she spoke again, her voice softer, almost breaking. "You think I'm your enemy." Dane's jaw tightened. "You raided our people," he said. "Killed men who never drew a gun." She shook her head slowly. "And your people never killed ours?" He had no answer. The silence between them grew heavier, pressing like the cold itself. "I was 10, she whispered, "when soldiers came to our village. They burned everything. My mother, my brothers, they didn't even look back." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "After that, I learned, everyone's someone's enemy." Dane swallowed hard. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. He wanted to speak, to offer some kind of comfort. But what could a lawman say to that? He'd seen war in different forms. Men with badges killing men without. And he'd always told himself it was for order, for justice. But now, looking at her, he wasn't so sure where justice ended and revenge began. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, the stars cold and bright above them. scattered like silver dust. Time passed slowly. The desert had a way of stretching every minute into an hour. The woman shifted slightly, her chains rattling faintly. "You have a name, Sheriff?" she asked. "Dane," he said. "Dane Hollister." "Hollister," she repeated as if tasting it. "Sounds like a man who used to believe in something." Her words made him look up sharply. "Used to?" She shrugged beneath the blanket. "You don't believe in much now. I can see it." He wanted to deny it, but the truth sat heavy in his chest. He'd buried his beliefs somewhere out there in the dust long ago, alongside the bodies of men he'd put down in the name of the law. He stood up and walked toward the edge of the camp, needing distance. The night was endless, the air so cold it burned in his lungs. Behind him, he heard her humming, a low, mournful tune that carried across the desert like a prayer. It wasn't a song he recognized, but it made something deep inside him ache. He turned back, watching her silhouette against the firelight. Her head was bowed, her shoulders trembling slightly beneath his blanket. For the first time, Dane saw not a prisoner, but a woman who had lost everything and somehow still held her pride like a shield. He walked back to the fire and sat again, this time closer. She didn't look up, but he noticed her humming stop. They sat in silence, two strangers bound by circumstance, their worlds divided by history neither of them had written. Hours drifted by. The flames sank lower, the shadows deepened. Dane felt his eyelids grow heavy, but her word from earlier lingered in his mind. Even fire can't warm a lonely heart. He wondered what loneliness meant to her. To him, it had always been the price of duty. To her, maybe it was the price of survival. He wanted to ask, but words failed him. Instead, he stirred the fire one last time and whispered, almost to himself, "Get some rest. I'll keep watch." She didn't answer, but when he glanced up, he caught her watching him. Not with hatred, but something quieter, something almost human. The moment passed quickly, but it stayed with him as the fire faded to embers. The desert night held them both, one bound by iron, the other by guilt, and somewhere between the stars and the silence, the lines between captor and captive began to blur. That night, neither of them truly slept. The sheriff dreamed of battles that weren't his to fight, and the Apache woman dreamed of fires that could never warm her heart again. And when dawn finally broke over the red sands of Arizona, two souls who had once been enemies shared the same cold morning light, both wondering, in their own quiet way, what it meant to be free. By sunrise, the fire had died to a faint orange glow, and the wind carried only ashes. Dane rubbed his eyes, feeling the cold bite deep into his bones. When he turned toward the wagon, his stomach twisted. The chain was empty. The Apache woman was gone. For a long moment, he just stared at the vacant spot where she had been, the blanket he'd given her folded neatly by the wheel, as if she'd meant for him to find it. He cursed under his breath, kicked dirt over the fire, and grabbed his rifle. The desert stretched endless in every direction, silent except for the wind whispering across the sand. He saw her footprints, light, deliberate, but unsteady. She hadn't gone far. She couldn't have, not with that chain still on her ankle. Dane mounted his horse and followed the trail. The morning light was thin and cold, painting everything in shades of rust and gold. He rode slow, eyes fixed on the faint line her footsteps carved through the dust. Every so often, he found a drop of blood, small, dark spots marking her path. She was hurt worse than she'd let on. The thought made his chest tighten in a way he didn't understand. He told himself it was duty, just duty, but deep down he knew it wasn't. The sun climbed higher, and the heat began to rise off the land, but still he pressed on, past the rocky ridges and the silent cacti that stood like sentinels watching him pass. When he finally saw her, she was sitting on a high ridge overlooking the desert. The broken shackle lay beside her, the metal twisted open as if she'd forced it loose with sheer will. Her ankle was bleeding, the skin raw and torn. She didn't look back when he approached, even when the sound of his horse broke the quiet. For a moment, he just watched her, the way her hair lifted in the wind, the way she sat upright, her gaze fixed on the rising sun. She looked small against the vastness of the land, Yet there was something about her presence that filled the space around her completely. "You should have run farther," Dane said finally, his voice carrying across the dry air. She didn't turn, but he saw her shoulders rise slightly. When she did speak, her tone was calm, almost peaceful. "I didn't want to run," she said. "I wanted to feel the sun one last time free." Her words hit him harder than a bullet. He stared her back, trying to find the right thing to say, but nothing came. She wasn't begging. She wasn't afraid. It was as if she'd already made her choice, and all he could do was witness it. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching on the sand. The rifle hung loose in his hand, but he didn't raise it. He walked closer until he could see her face in the morning light. There was no anger there, no hate, just a strange stillness, like someone who had already left this world in spirit, even if her body hadn't caught up yet. "You'll die out here," he said. "There's nothing but heat and dust for miles." She smiled faintly, her lips cracked and dry. "Then I'll die free," she murmured. "That's more than most people ever get." For a long time, neither spoke. The wind stirred her hair across her face, and he reached out without thinking, then stopped himself. He wanted to free her completely, to cut away the pain that hung around her like a shadow, but he didn't know how. He was a man of the law. He'd built his whole life on rules, orders, and borders. Yet here, standing in the open desert, the law felt like nothing more than a heavy chain dragging behind him. He looked down at the broken shackle, then back into her eyes, steady, calm, fearless. That was when he understood. She didn't belong in a cell. She belonged to the land, to the wind, to the endless horizon that asked nothing and gave everything. Dane took off his hat, feeling the sun sting the top of his head. He stepped back, his heart heavy but sure. "Go," he said quietly. The word felt strange on his tongue, like releasing something he hadn't realized he was holding. She didn't move at first. The wind swept between them, lifting dust into the air. Then, slowly, she stood. Her legs trembled, but she stayed upright. She turned to face him, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled. It wasn't the smile of a prisoner or an outlaw. It was the smile of someone who had finally found peace. That smile would stay with him forever. It was small, faint, but it carried more strength than anything he'd ever seen in a courtroom or a gunfight. She looked at him one last time and whispered something he barely caught, something about forgiveness and fire. Then she turned and began to walk toward the sun, each step unsteady but sure. The light touched her skin, turning her silhouette golden as she disappeared into the glare. He wanted to call out, to tell her to wait, but his voice caught in his throat. Some part of him knew that if he spoke, he'd break whatever fragile freedom she'd just found. He stood there until she was gone. The horizon swallowed her whole, leaving nothing but her fading footprints in the sand. Dane finally exhaled, the breath shaking out of him like a confession. The silence felt heavier now. Not empty, but sacred, like the desert itself was holding its breath. He knelt by the ridge and picked up the broken shackle, turning it over in his hands. The metal was still warm from her skin. He thought about melting it down, turning it into something harmless, maybe a horseshoe or a buckle. But in the end, he just laid it gently on the ground and left it there. Some things, he realized, weren't meant to be carried. The sun climbed higher, washing the land in blinding gold. Dane put his hat back on and walked his horse. The animal nickered softly, sensing his mood. He mounted up, staring once more at the horizon where she had vanished. "No one should sleep alone in the cold," he whispered. The words came out rough, cracked by the dryness in his throat, but they carried meaning he'd never spoken aloud before. Maybe he'd been talking to her, maybe to himself. Either way, the desert took his words and carried them off, scattering them like ashes on the wind. As he rode back toward town, he thought about the people waiting there, the judge, the deputy, the angry settlers who'd wanted blood. He wondered what he'd tell them. Maybe he'd say she escaped. Maybe he'd say he lost her trail. But the truth, that he'd let her go, was something he'd keep to himself. Some truths belonged to the silence. The desert, after all, didn't judge. It simply remembered. Hours later, when the sun began to sink again, Dane stopped by a dry creek bed to rest. The same wind that had carried her footprints away now whispered through the canyons, cool and hollow. He built a small fire and sat beside it, staring into the flames. He saw her face there, flickering in the light, proud, unbroken, free. For the first time in years, his heart felt light. The fire's warmth touched his hands, and he thought about her words again. Even fire can't warm a lonely heart. He smiled faintly. Maybe she had been right. But for that one morning, as he'd watched her walk toward the sun, he hadn't felt lonely at all. Somewhere out there, in an endless stretch of red earth and blue sky, she was free, and that was enough. The wind shifted again, cool and gentle, brushing across his face like a whisper. He closed his eyes, letting it carry him towards sleep, and for the first time in a long while, the night didn't feel cold.